Hey there, Chaos Crew. Welcome back to another thrilling episode of Minxy's Mischief Hour, where chaos meets creativity and we dive into the wild and wonderful world of speculative fiction. I'm your host, Minxy, and today we have a truly inspiring guest joining us. We are excited to welcome Marie Cantrelle. She is a talented speculative fiction author known for creating diverse characters and exploring non-European fantasy and science fiction. In this episode, we'll be diving deep into the concept of inspiration. Where do ideas come from? What sparks the creative process? And what drives our fabulous author to write? Plus, we'll get an exclusive sneak peek into their upcoming book, Lifeshaper, set to release on June 24th, which was, that was yesterday. So get comfy, grab your drink, and join us for an insightful conversation. Let's explore some magic behind these stories. Welcome to the show, Marie Cantrelle.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background in writing?
So I have been writing. I feel like this is sort of a cliche thing for writers sometimes, but I've been writing since I was very young. I have these memories in like middle school of I had a friend of mine at the time. We would like write back and forth. So one person would write a piece of the story, and then we would literally in a notebook pass it to the other person, and they would write some, and then we would go back and forth. So I always have memories of writing, and it wasn't until maybe about 3 or 4 years ago that I started to consider actually doing it for real. Actually trying my hand at novel writing. Before that, I had mostly done sort of short story writing. And I was really like, I don't know, can I do this for a whole novel? But I decided, let's give it a shot, see what happens. And, here we are now.
And what actually inspired you to start writing into speculative fiction?
I just think I've always been more drawn to sort of the fantastical. I have these memories when I was younger, always going to the library and checking out books and reading. And it was always the books with a little of the unreal that stuck with me. I was never much one for nonfiction or fiction that seemed like it could happen. Although, I have to admit, lately I have been into some nonfiction stuff, but it just, there's something about like just cracking open a book and being transported to somewhere that just doesn't exist in reality, just totally unique space that I find really interesting. And also, I think that with speculative fiction, you can explore some things about the real world in a way that gives you a break from the real world, if that makes sense. So
That
sometimes
absolutely makes sense.
Yeah. Sometimes the real world is like, okay, like it's too much is going on, or I feel like, I don't know, politics and war and all these things that are super important and yet can be so they just get you down. So speculative fiction, I think, helps to explore some of those things that are very applicable to the real world, but in a way that gets you away from it a little bit.
Yes, so kind of like exploring the world and living in a world without the thought of taxes, probably.
Yeah.
For our audience, could you explain non-European fantasy and science fiction?
Sure. I think a lot of the quote unquote mainstream fantasy and sci-fi, well, let's start with fantasy, goes back to either kind of King Arthur tales or Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. I mean, there's no doubt that a lot of fantasy draws from those sources, and that's great. I love a lot of that kind of fantasy. But what I was noticing was that there was not as much fantasy that explored themes or settings based on other perspectives. And so there are certainly authors doing that. Going back to, I mean, I think Octavia Butler is the person that everybody looks back to as kind of the gold standard of that. But more contemporary people like N.K. Jemisin, for example. And there's so much interesting stuff there in terms of history, in terms of folklore and mythologies that are just really underexplored. And to me, that is so interesting. It's so I've always been interested in learning about those kinds of mythologies, and in writing, I get to do that in a way that is maybe a little bit more unique.
So what's your favorite myth? Like, of the ones that you've read and learned about, what's your favorite myth or legend or any of the above?
Oh man. Favorite myth or legend. I'll start with, it's not myth or legend, but it's history. And I just really love learning about like Mesopotamia, kind of one of those first civilizations with their ziggurats, and there's not a whole lot. We know some of the history and some of what life was like, but a lot of the texts and things like that didn't survive because of how they were writing at that time. And some of the myths get really interesting because they get confused based on the time period or whatever, which is true of kind of all oral traditions. We think about like Greek mythology and how it's very different based on when the myths came around and how they kind of change. But so I would say I really like exploring that history. In terms of mythology, I think what's interesting so I'm a Black woman living in America, and so there's a lot of, there's a history of slavery in the US, and a lot of the mythologies from Africa sort of made their way and were adapted in interesting ways. So I'm from Louisiana in the States, and we have these tales of Lapin and Buki, which is rabbit, and Buki, I guess, is a hyena, which is an animal that does not exist in Louisiana.
No, I was going to say, are there even hyenas there?
No. But those are myths that probably originated in Africa and were brought over and adapted to the setting and to the time period, to the reality that people were living in. And so I love that kind of thing, where it's almost a mix between history and myth, because what's super interesting to me is how the myths travel and how they evolve. And so I guess that's what I would say there.
So you were speaking a little bit, obviously, about some history and culture, even in the States. You diversify your characters quite a bit, is that correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you sort of talk us through how you sort of define your characters and what inspires you to design them in the way that you're imagining, and also for the readers as well?
Yeah, I think when I'm writing a character, sometimes they just come fully formed, and it like comes to you in a dream or something. And you're like, yep, that's what they are. Other characters develop from the setting that I create. So in Lifeshaper, which we'll talk a little bit more about, I'm sure.
Yes.
I kind of was basing this on that Mesopotamia area of the world, and kind of south down into northern Africa and up into almost parts of southern Europe. And so thinking about what people would look like, or what they culturally would do based on geography, for example. And so, what people will look like based on all those things, and based on the world that I created, which is not a one-for-one, recreation of that part of the world. but I tried to be consistent based on geography and things like that. Because, I mean, for a lot of the history of the world, that's until global travel was a thing, that's what the world sort of looked like. And there were certainly areas of the world in historical times that were very multicultural, and the same is true in my book. But then there are also areas that are very homogenous. And so in terms of racial diversity, that's what I would say. I also thought about things like sort of ethnic diversity, which is slightly different, or cultural diversity, when people in different areas are not going to necessarily have the same beliefs or same, even if there's a dominant religion, they may not follow it the same way or have similar
absolutely. Most of our
understandings
countries
of it.
these days have different. Everyone follows different things. Everyone has a very different belief system, even now.
Yeah. And so it's also thinking about, yes, culturally there are differences, but there's also individual differences, right? So people have a different understanding of the world based on their upbringing. And I really wanted to bring that in with the characters, and because otherwise everything feels kind of samey. It's not like,
No,
not.
I absolutely respect that. I absolutely respect that. That's actually a really brilliant way to think about how you're diversifying your writing, not necessarily adjusting or changing history. You're sort of emphasizing how amazing it once was as well, but pushing it into a fantasy style position is wonderful. Your writing process, is it very similar when it comes to creating your characters and your mythology, or do you have like a specific writing process where you're like, nope, I will do all the research first and then I'll start, or you'll research halfway through, or you'll research at the end and go, nope, I guess I'm changing my book?
Yeah. So, with Lifeshaper being my debut novel, it was kind of a learning process for sure to kind of figure out how I was going to be a writer. And I think originally I had a few ideas that I definitely wanted to bring in terms of characters and their abilities, initial inspiration. And then I kind of started doing a lot of research into, all right, what I knew I wanted to kind of bring in some ideas from Mesopotamia, and sort of that civilization. So I started reading up on that, and on some of the technology they had at the time, some things that are just super interesting about that time, and even small details like the fact that we have this sort of image in fantasy of people using like wax seals, right? Or they have like the signet rings where they press into the wax to seal it. And in Mesopotamia, they had cylinder seals, which were just like these little beads that were carved, and they would use that as like a personal seal. So just even small details like that. But what I quickly started realizing is like, okay, I can research forever. Never start writing. So at a certain point, it's like, okay, you just got to get some things on paper and see how things evolve from there. And it kind of became sort of a back and forth where there were times where like, okay, I need to stop and do some more research, or think about like, how long would it take people on horseback to get from point A to point Z?
I feel like every author has Googled that at least once, because I certainly did.
Yeah. There's actually like this great resource, and I forget who made it, but it's like some university or something that based on all these factors can tell you how long it takes. So
Amazing.
so things like that, things then at a certain point, deciding how much I wanted to be realistic to the real world. Like, do I want this to be like Mesopotamia exactly, or did I want to take some things and kind of mold it or change things from there? And I think what I landed on eventually is I didn't want it to be kind of a history lesson. I wanted to sort of take the inspiration and go from there. I didn't want it to be like a one-to-one creation. So there are aspects of it that as you read, you might, if you know anything about Mesopotamia, you might be like, okay, I see that. And then there are aspects that are totally not that at all.
So you started with the setting for your book, or did it actually inspire from a particular character?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I definitely had the idea for a couple of characters first. Because I mean, I think really the characters are kind of the central point of this. So I had the idea for the main character, Kita, and I didn't really have a good sense of what she was going to be, but I had a good sense of how the plot was going to kick off around her. And then she changed a lot from that initial thought. And another character as well, Weirin, he was also there pretty much from the beginning. And those two characters really they're really the most central characters to the book still. But they both have changed quite a lot since that initial, the initial thought of them. But I definitely started
so they
there.
Developed as well as in the book.
Oh yeah.
So your characters, you would have had to obviously gone through a lot of challenges developing them. You've also had a lot of challenges going through history, trying to implement knowledge into your stories as well, pushing it also into a fantasy realm. So what was the biggest challenge? I mean, all these things could have happened all at once, but was there one particular big challenge that you came across? You're like, oh man, I think I'm going to throw in the towel at this point.
Yeah, I think it's probably common with writers, but like the middle of the book.
Yep.
I think most people, when they're writing, have a pretty good sense of how it starts and what is like that sort of inciting incident or what's the main conflict. And for me, that was definitely true. And I had a good sense of how I wanted to end it, at least sort of generally. I didn't have everything totally plotted out. But I had like an idea of, okay, I think I know kind of what the climax is going to be. Getting from at point A to point B. And I was like, how are we getting here? So I found that pretty hard, and I went through, there were chapters that I rewrote several times because it wasn't making sense to me. And I'm like, if it's not making sense to me, it's not going to make sense to the person reading it. And so it went through a lot of iterations until finally I almost just had like, there was one chapter that I wrote that kind of tied it together, and I was like, okay. We're okay.
You finally found that missing piece of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
So we're hearing so much about the book now that we're going to start talking about it. So Lifeshaper, elevator pitch it to us. Tell us why we need to read this book.
Oh man, this is always the question. I'm so bad at elevator pitching, I feel like. But so I'll give you the quick rundown. So we're in this setting where for whatever reason, and certainly the temples have an opinion on why, everyone seems to have some ability, a power to kind of shape the world around them in some way, and some are more powerful than others. And the princess Kita is maybe one of the most powerful, but she does lose control of her power at a certain point at a very public ball, which results in people dying. And she doesn't understand why that happened. Nobody really seems to get it, but she seems pretty confident that if she sticks around, the emperor, her grandfather, will kill her, execute her. So she goes on the run. While she is escaping and trying to evade capture, she meets this guy, Weirin, who has almost the opposite power to her, where she can create life, the titular Lifeshaper, as it were. He has power over death. And he kind of lets her in on a little secret that he's planning on a revolution. And he's very interested in trying to bring her on board. So, I won't say too much more than that, but that is kind of the central plot. And in terms of why you should read it, I just think it's so interesting. These sorts of conflicts that are political and power-based in multiple ways, right? Power in terms of actual physical abilities, but also political power. And that's a theme that I really tried to look at, and what happens when powerful people kind of have their head in the sand. Because at the end of the day, Keto's really privileged growing up, and maybe was blind to a lot of suffering and a lot of suffering, but does that make her complicit in it?
Yeah,
those are some of
she
the
would have
questions.
had quite a bit of character development then, going through everything she, I assume, then goes through in the book.
Yeah.
That's actually a pretty good pitch, I will admit. I'm very intrigued. It's actually already on my to be read list because it comes out, I'm still apologize, it would have been yesterday for me, but today for yourself, is that correct?
No, it was
24th?
yesterday.
Oh yeah, it was yesterday? Okay, no problem. So it is out. It means everyone can start reading it. Yeah, no time zones. It's, oh my goodness. But everyone can start reading it. So it's at a very exciting time for you. Did you send out arcs previous to the launch? Did you get feedback from anyone as of yet for the book?
I've sent out a few, but I haven't heard back. And so I'm always very oh my gosh, what do people think? Of course, during the writing process, I got a lot of feedback.
Oh, that's great.
It incorporated, but this version of it, I'm waiting for people to tell me.
Are you planning a next book? Is there one that comes after this one?
Yes, I'm actually already working on it. It is the sequel. I had this thought the other day. I was like, is this going to be a duology or is it going to be a trilogy? And that kind of depends on how it goes as I'm writing. I'm learning about myself as I write, that I can have all the plans I want. The book will go where it goes. So I'm definitely working on the sequel. It may be the end of the story. It may be the middle portion of the story. We will see. But
very exciting.
And there's sorry. There's also a prequel kicking around in my brain that may come at a later date.
Oh, we do love prequels. So for aspiring writers, especially those ones that are interested in speculative fiction, do you have any advice, given that you've only just recently gone through the process for your first debut novel? Is there anything that you would tell them before they sit down and start writing?
I would say, the biggest thing I would say is just do it, as in the immortal words of Nike, right? Just do it, because I think what was so paralyzing for a long time for me in terms of this sort of process was thinking, a lot of thinking, right? And you have the perfect chapter written in your head, and that doesn't count. It just doesn't, right? Until you get something on paper, it's all just living in your head. And you can do all the research in the world, but you can also get stuck doing research forever. And sometimes it doesn't matter that much. Because, you have to think about, is this a detail that is going to add to the story, or is it a detail I'm just adding because I learned it? And, so just writing is the biggest thing, because it's always, you can always change it, right? You can always, if you come across something new or you have a new thought, you can always make changes. But if you don't have anything written down, then you haven't begun, really.
So with your books at the moment, what do you really hope readers are going to take away after they finish and like close the book, last chapter, all done? What are you hoping their biggest takeaway is?
I think the main thing is, of course, you want people to come away being like, I enjoyed this. This was worth my time. But also, I hope that they would think about some of these issues of power and injustice, and what justice means. Also thinking about, the company you keep and what that means for you. There's themes of family and what that means. And I would hope that as people read through this book, they kind of meditate on all of those things. If even on a subconscious level, because not everybody reads a book thinking about like, okay, what am I supposed to get out of this? Some people certainly do, and I certainly kind of think about those kinds of things when I'm reading. So it's okay with me if it's not like a conscious thing, that people are like coming away and being like, I have changed the way I view the world. But I hope that I've at least kind of given another way to think about things.
I like that. I like that a lot. So I'm going to jump into a bit more fun questions, just so we can have a bit of a banter and a chat.
Sure.
If you could meet any character from any book, who would it be and why?
Oh my goodness. This is probably not a good answer because I don't think they would actually be good to meet. But I've been watching and reading about a lot of House of the Dragon stuff. And so
I see where this is going.
yeah. And so I kind of would like love to meet like Daemon Targaryen, even though I think it would not be a fun time. But it's just the first thing that came to mind. And it might be colored by the fact that he's played by Matt Smith in the show. I don't know. But
that's probably very true.
Yeah.
But that's a really good answer. I like that one quite a bit. Tell our audience one fun or interesting fact about yourself, nothing to do with books.
Okay. I have 2 cats that are both named after villains. I have Selena Kyle, who is Catwoman, and then Azula, who is as feisty as her namesake. And
that's for our Airbender fans, is that correct?
Yep.
Wonderful, as we love. We do love our Airbender fans here. We have quite a few. So, do you have any plans to write any stories not connected to your Lifeshaper book potential duology, potential trilogy? Sorry, potential trilogy.
Yeah, I do. I have started writing this book like 2 or 3 times and then abandoned it and started again. But I have a title, but but not the book, which is very unusual for me. The title is usually the last thing I do. But it's called Nightwear, and it is about cyberpunk vampires. Which actually is based on an image from a dream, which was somebody getting like cybernetic implants installed while they were awake. And I was like, why would that happen? And I was like, maybe because they're a vampire. And then like the whole idea stemmed from that. And so it's surprising, well, maybe not surprising, it's very difficult to kind of blend those kind of genres together because they are very different genres. But I'm like, well, why can't vampires exist in like the future? Why do we always have to have them either right now or in the past? So that is an idea, like I said, that has been kicking around. I definitely want to write it. It's been a difficult book. It's like resisting being written, but
it sounds like something we could sink our teeth into. I feel like I need a So how is our readers going to get in touch with you and stay updated on your work from here?
Yeah, I think the best way would be on my Instagram, which is A Marie Cantrelle. Um, that's kind of where I've been doing most of my updating. Just find it easiest to do that. And also, you can find my other kind of areas from there. So I would say that. And yeah, see, I do things like post character playlists, which I had a ball doing, and writing tips, the occasional cat photo. So it's a good time.
Amazing. So before we finish off, are there any final thoughts, messages that you want to shout out to the Chaos Crew listeners while you're here?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, please read my book. And I just think speculative fiction is just such a wide world out there, and there's so much cool stuff being written and so much cool stuff that is unique and doing new and interesting things with genre, with characters, with setting, that I just encourage people to read. Like, obviously you can't read everything, but read something new and different, and unexpected, even if it's not my book, something that when you read the blurb for it, you're like, okay, this is something I haven't seen before.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to, of course, say thank you so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute pleasure. And of course, to all the listeners, don't forget to check out Lifeshaper. It is available now, so you can go and check it out right now. Don't forget to follow A Marie Cantrelle on Instagram. I will still post links in the description. But until next time, stay creative, stay geeky, and most importantly, stay chaotic.